This is Learning Science Unpacked, a podcast mini-series from Sponge, dedicated to unpacking the science behind how we learn and behave. Over the next few sessions, I'll be digging deep into the science of learning with Professor Paul Howard-Jones, an educational neuroscientist at Bristol University. Together, we'll uncover the most effective strategies workplace learning professionals can use to optimise learning for performance, something we do at Sponge every day. Welcome to this episode of Learning Science Unpacked, where today we're going to be talking games, play and learning. I'm delighted to be welcoming an additional guest today, Carl Kapp. Carl is a professor of instructional technology at Bloomsburg University in Pennsylvania, where he teaches instructional game design, gamification classes and online learning design. Carl is also the author or co-author of 8 books, including The Gamification of Learning and Instruction and its accompanying field book, which I have with me here, the widely popular Play to Learn. Carl is also the author of 10 LinkedIn Learning classes, and he's been a TEDx speaker. So how wonderful today to be able to have Carl, your games and behavioural expertise, joined together with Paul, your educational neuroscientific expertise. I want to welcome you both and say thank you very much for joining me today.
Pleasure. Yeah, thank you. Great to be here.
Excellent. Well, by way of a warm-up, I thought I might just ask you each a question. And Carl, I'm going to go with you first. What is the game that you've been playing most recently, and what do you enjoy about it most?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one game that I play literally every day is Plants vs. Zombies. And it seems like a really simple game, but what I like about it is the level of the looping that it has. So you have to get sun to order to buy good plants, and you have to have good plants in order to kill the zombies. And so it's kind of this really interesting feedback loop and strategy of where to place the plants and how to defeat the zombies and that kind of stuff. So that's a digital game. And then a board game I've been playing is called The Grizzled, which I happen to have here. This is actually a cooperative game, and it's about life in the trenches in World War I. And you have got to help out your fellow players so that you all survive. So it's all the players against the game. So those are 2 games that I've been exploring lately. Well, Plants vs. Zombies all the time, but Grizzled is one that I've been exploring lately and really enjoying that game.
Thank you. Super. And Paul, what about you?
Every week I play Star Wars Battlefront with my son. Which I love, and I sort of moved from being one of those parents who really worried about how much their kids were playing action video games to somebody who I actually try to make time for it. I try to do it because I've learned, through reading the research that actually action video games are really good for sustaining cognitive function, particularly of gentlemen of my age. So it's sort of, he's 15. I must have played it about 200, 300 times with him, and I've only beaten him on one occasion. I think he was coming down with flu, but it felt so good. So I'm still but it keeps me engaged. I think that's interesting because you're moving up the levels. You can see your own progress and your progress. It's sometimes we play as a team, which is quite nice. You're against, artificial intelligence, sort of Imperial Guards or whatever. And I think that's so. And as I've gained confidence, I've been able to really sort of be competitive and actually play against him, which as I say, I always fail, but still it's managed to maintain my engagement, which I think is interesting. But in terms of board games, actually Catan is what I've become a little bit obsessed with. It's a great family game, but what I particularly like about it compared with something like Monopoly is the trajectory, because you're never completely sure right up until the end who's going to win. And it's staged. The sort of rewards and the payouts are staged in a way whereby they're accelerating at a rate that you can't anticipate who's going to be the winner. Whereas with Monopoly, I always find that you get to that point where that you're going to lose, and it's just a matter of seeing your money depleted. It's too much like life.
That's when you flip the board over and walk away in disgust.
Well, that's fascinating that you've both got games that seem to be really engaging you, and lovely as well that you can play them with your kids and kind of include others. And I suppose what we're kind of interested in is about games and learning. And so I wanted to kind of unpick this a little bit and maybe ask Paul, start with you. What do we know about why games are good for learning?
Well, it's interesting because there's been this argument raging for some time about whether the video games are good for you or bad for you. And of course, it all depends how you're using the game. But I think one of the things that has become apparent is that there are some things that the brain needs to do on an everyday level that actually video games are really good at. And one of those, as I mentioned, is visual motor response. And also judging the statistical likelihood of something happening. I think it's called probability inference or something. So those sorts of things are actually, very fast responses. That's excited people because they can see that the plasticity of the brain is changing in response, particularly to action video games. So I suppose that's one of the reasons why we've started becoming interested in it. It's a whole different ballgame how you capture some of those processes in games that are educational so that you can actually meet learning outcomes. But I guess that's what, it's that sort of results, I guess, which sort of started some of the gold rush, or that sense that, this is something we've really got to put into education, at least in terms of scientific results, I think. So yeah, that was a starting point for me, I think, seeing that research.
And Carl, you've looked at kind of the history of games, and learning from games isn't new, is that right?
Right. No, it's fascinating to me how humans kind of repeat history. So actually, I've been studying some card games that go back to 960 AD in China. Now, it was fascinating because it's not a suit game like we know, like hearts and spades, and it's actually a scenario game. And it's not, I have to admit, it's not a learning game, it's a drinking game. So you have the scenario, you have to find people and you have to drink together and that kind of thing. But then fast forward to like the 15th century, already card games were being used for learning. And before that, some of the original games they believe were military strategy games, some ancient versions of chess. And then in the 1600s, the Prussians started using wargaming. So when you think about organizations thinking about strategy and thinking about what-if analysis, wargaming and gaming in general has been used for a long, long time. And another fascinating story is that in World War II, all sides did wargaming to anticipate what the other side was doing. And there's a story actually takes place somewhere in Britain where this woman was so knowledgeable about wargaming, an admiral came in and couldn't believe that she knew so much and challenged her, and she won like every time. So that really sense of using games for learning about the context around you, for learning new information, for learning how to make the right decision, the social impact. That's been around for a long, long time. In the 2000s, when the Oregon Trail and all those kind of games came online, literally. That really kind of sparked a lot of interest in, what can video games do for learning? But there had been a lot of interest before then. In fact, the first game used in a corporation was in the 1930s by a woman named Mary Burstein, who was actually in Russia to teach people how to run and operate a typewriter factory, because they didn't have people that were skilled in running these factories to produce typewriters. So it's been since the 1930s, at least in corporations, people have been using game. And she used war game strategies and an umpire and the same type of design. So games have been around for a while, have taught us a lot for a while, and continue to inform us in terms of understanding our situation, but also then predicting the future, learning new skills, and determining what actions are acceptable or not acceptable.
And while I've been looking at Play to Learn, at the beginning of the book, you give a really good definition of a game, which, if you don't mind, I'm going to read it out. It's kind of comprehensive, but I thought we could unpack it together, because there are some really key things in here, which I think if we can understand that seems to me to be the core of it. So you say a game is an activity that has a goal, a challenge or challenges, and rules that guide achievement of the goal. Interactivity with the other players or the game environment or both. And feedback mechanisms that give clear cues as to how well or poorly you are performing. You talked about that a minute ago with the kind of games that you've been playing. It results in a quantifiable outcome. You win or you lose, you hit the target and so on. That usually generates an emotional reaction in players. I love that. I noticed that fun is omitted.
It
so
is,
perhaps,
purposely.
Yeah, we should talk
Yes.
about that. But maybe in that definition, which of those things do you think really kind of sets games apart from, say, play, for instance?
So I think the primary element that sets a game apart from play is an end goal. So if kids are playing in the sandbox, there's not typically an end goal. I give the example, you're splashing around in the pool and a friend of yours says, "Hey, I'll race you to the other side." All of a sudden, it's no longer play, it's a game, and you've got a clear outcome. But you also have rules. So if you get out of the pool and run on the sidewalk and jump in on the other side, your friend will say, "Hey, that's cheating," right? Where it's a swim race, right? So there's certain implicit rules that come along with this object or goal. I always say, golf would be a really great game if you could pick up the ball and put it in that stupid little hole, but you can't do it. It's the rules. So sometimes those impediments are what makes it challenging and interesting, and also allows us, in the ancient times, allowed us to compare one to another, and still today, I guess, hey, I'll race you to that tree. Well, why was that important? Well, because you need to be able to outrun, some predators, or you need to be able to know that you could outflank the game that you're trying to catch, the fowl or whatever that you're trying to catch. So the idea of having a goal turns it from a playful activity into a game. And then what comes along with the goal are rules, which then provide these parameters, or sometimes people call it the magic circle, right? You can or cannot do things in this magic circle of the game that you would or wouldn't do in a real situation, right? So if you really wanted to be efficient with golf, you'd pick up the ball. If you really wanted to get to the other side, you might get out and run. But the parameters of the game make it so that it's a challenge, or it's a different way of doing it. And it's amazing the things that we gamify. So for example, here in the United States, this is so US centric, we have a hot dog eating contest every 4th of July.
It's just happened.
Yeah, and the guy ate a world record amount of hot dogs. So you can even take something like food, which has no real goal except to survive, and all of a sudden you add this parameter, which is who can eat the most, and all of a sudden you have rules like you're not allowed to throw up. I mean, it's crazy, but that's what turns play and even food into a game.
Excellent. Paul, did you want to bring in anything there on sort of game understanding? I'm thinking that you might be hungry now.
I just had my lunch, so that's a bit like...
okay. Didn't have too much, did you?
I don't feel like I have now, but yeah, I suppose it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I'm thinking of a study that was done where a teacher actually gave a particular task to children and said, this is an important exercise for you to be doing for your learning. And then they gave exactly the same task to another group of students and said, this is a game. And they actually responded differently to it. So to some extent, I think Carl's right. You can take almost anything and sort of turn it into a game just by saying it's a game. But I suppose on the other hand, one thing that there are different ways of doing that. You can turn something into a game not just by calling it a game, but also I think you can introduce luck. I think luck's quite a big issue. I think if the outcome is purely based on your ability, you might say, because it's like, is the Olympics, are those, well, we do call them the games, don't we, I suppose? So yeah, okay. but it's a kind of, is it a different experience when you're competing to achieve, and the outcome is based purely on your ability without any element of luck? I think quite often when we say, oh, it's just a game, we're actually talking about contexts where there is a certain amount of luck involved, uncertainty, if you like, reward uncertainty. So and that automatically turns it into much more of a game. So if you say, well, I want you to do this, but actually you don't know if this is going to happen or that's going to happen. You may open that box, you might open that box, something different is going to. Then actually that also turns it into a game, just because you've introduced this element of uncertainty, so that the person's no longer completely in control of it. But then an awful lot of life is like that, and I think this goes back to this idea that really we've evolved to live a life which is more like a game than many of the things that we are expected to do on a daily basis and learn from.
Well, you touched on a few interesting kind of things there around luck, and I was thinking about the sort of emotional reaction in players when you mentioned about the Olympics. I thought that was really interesting. That, I think for me, the Olympics kind of does tie in with the definition that we just heard. Let me just come back to this question of why fun is not included in your definition, Carl.
Mm-hmm. So because games can be frustrating, they can be sad, they can be angry, they can be all kinds of things. Mostly they're emotional, but we had talked about, I think, flipping the Monopoly board, right? So you get mad in the game and you flip. It's not acceptable behavior anywhere else, right? You're not allowed to throw a tantrum or whatever, but in a game sometimes people do that and you kind of take it for granted. Or there are games that actually force you to do behavior that's not appropriate. Cards Against Humanity is a good example of that. So games give us, and even as I was talking about, in 960 AD, the game where you have to drink. There's another game in the Ming Dynasty period where you're supposed to close your eyes and yell out profanity. So Cards Against Humanity is not like this first, breaking taboo kind of games. But the other interesting thing is some of the research about learning from games indicates that you don't have to indicate that you had fun in order to learn. So I think that's a really important element. A lot of people say, oh, games for learning, they have to be fun. They don't necessarily have to be fun. They have to be engaging. They have to cause you to make decisions. They have to be challenging. I think chance and uncertainty is a really good element in those games because that's life. You don't know what's going to happen. But it doesn't have to be, rolling on the floor, haha, fun. So I don't think that that's a necessary definition. It's certainly not one for learning. And then to go back to Paul's earlier point, I think he makes a really good point. Game is a huge, broad category. So I read somewhere sometime that Eskimos have 56 different words for snow to indicate the different types of snow, and we need 56 different words at least for game. There's a lot of different kinds of games, and there's different definitions, but I don't think there are any that are as descriptive as maybe we would like. Some people say, well, the Olympics, that's a competition. It's not really a game because you are competing against one another, right? Well, is competition under this larger umbrella of game? It's a very thing, and the game of life, right, that we play, or gaming the system, or she's got game. Like all of this is referring to generally the same thing, but not specifically the same thing. So I think that's kind of interesting. But the one thing I see in a lot of learning game development wish list, or when clients come to me, they say we want it to be fun because we want them to learn and engage. And fun's not the goal. I always say if you want somebody to have fun, give them the day off. If you want them to learn, make an engaging game. And so that's really what you should think about when you create game, and that's why fun's not in the definition.
Thank you for that. And I'm just going to read out something else from the book that you've cited, Kevin Werbeck. Is that the right way to say his name?
Yes.
Who talks about engagement, kind of qualities that make a game engaging or fun. And it says winning, achieving goals, triumphing, collaborating, exploring, collecting, building, problem solving, strategizing, being surprised, role-playing, and imagining. And I think, that list is really helpful because that starts to help us as designers think about, well, what kind of techniques might we use to get to this point of engagement? And Paul, I'm sure you've got lots to say about, well, I know you have lots to say about engagement and, the gateway to learning. But what do you think about those kind of aspects?
Well, I was just listening to that list and thinking, yeah, actually, every one of those, there are studies, I think, or at least most of them, there are studies showing activation of the brain's reward system in response to that type of task. And that's how I think about engagement. And I also have an issue with the word fun. I mean, I think many of the ways in which we try to increase engagement in games could be referred to as increasing fun. But actually the word fun doesn't really explain what's going on, because the way in which we're talking of the processes and the reward system that we're talking about are actually wanting, not liking. So this is a very important distinction that neuroscience makes. It's a different set of processes for liking than it is to wanting. And it's the wanting that you really want to be, tapping into in the design of a game. And a classic example of this was when I had some students, and we were trying them out with this new learning game scenario. I think it's learning some science concepts, and they turned around to me and said, "This is horrible. This is an awful game. Why have you given us this? We absolutely hate it. Can you give us another 20 minutes, please?"
Why did they not like it? What was?
They didn't like it because it was frustrating.
Oh, okay.
But at the same time, they had to carry on with it. And that, so which kind of demonstrates this dissociation that we have sometimes between and liking. Of course, the extreme version of this is drug addiction. That as you become more and more, of a user, so you want the drug more and more, but actually you like and enjoy using it less and less. I'm now tapping into all these worries about video game addiction and things like this. But the processes by which video games engage their players, it is using the same brain system as all these other pleasures, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's like a drug or anything like that. But it's an interesting, this dissociation is still important, I think. Mostly in life, what we want, we also like. So it kind of works out happily, I think. But it is actually the wanting that we're trying to tap into.
Well, I want to ask a question now about, and this came up from someone inside Sponge who was kind of hoping for a definition on this, the difference between a game that we've been talking about and gamification. Perhaps, Carl, you might like to.
Yeah, I get asked that question a lot. I think gamification and game are kind of, well, there's several ways to look at it. One is on a continuum. So gamification is simply adding game elements in typical non-game situations. A game, I typically say, is a self-contained experience that has a defined beginning, middle, and end. But they become very, very blurry. So in the United States, there used to be a commercial, how many licks does it take to get to the center of a Tootsie Pop? And there was this wise owl, and the owl would take 3 licks and then bite the Tootsie Pop and say, oh, it takes 3, right? So it's just totally random. So I say, oh, yeah, it takes 3 items to turn gamification into a game. But there's really no definitive definition of when a game. I talk about 2 types of gamification. Well, 3 types. One I call structural gamification, where you take learning content and you put a game structure around it. So, you get 10 points for answering this question, 5 points for watching a video. The content would be the same if you had the points or not, but we have that. The other type I call is content gamification, where you add game elements that fundamentally change the content. So rather than presenting the content as learning objectives, you present it as a story. Rather than asking people, telling them what the right answer is, you have them make a critical decision that changes the outcome of the instruction or redirects it. So that's another way to do it, content gamification, I call that, which is very similar to a game. And then the third level I call performance gamification, where it's actually tied into your job. So things that you do on the job, you would get points for anyway. You're supposed to check credit, you get 5 points. You're supposed to be off the phone with the customer in 3 seconds, you're off the phone, you get the points, right? You get the leaderboard because you hang up on everyone. So that's really the kind of ways I think about gamification. Then a learning game, I think of a longer term, more game elements, more self-contained. But the one important thing you have to think about, both with games and gamification, is that when you play a game, just because you play the game doesn't mean you're going to learn from it. You have to have a debrief and a reflection. And the research is pretty clear. You should set the game up, have the learners play the game, and then debrief or do an action after review or reflect so that that learning can be generalizable. Otherwise, you played a game, congratulations. But if we don't make the effort as designers of games to solidify that knowledge or help them solidify that knowledge, then if they learn from it, that might be lucky. So we need to be purposeful.
And Paul, you can kind of speak to that a bit from a consolidation and practice point of view, potentially.
Yeah, I think I'm going to stick with Carl's definitions because he's thought about this a lot more. I mean, my intuition, though, because I've used this word gamification, as you know, in some of my papers and things, and I suppose from an educational point of view, there's a kind of philosophy there that you can take a learning experience and gamify it. I'd be interested to know if Carl thinks it could go the other way, so that you could actually take a game and then think, well, could we learn something from this? And maybe that would be a more successful way of producing, games that are also learning experiences.
I think absolutely. Catan's a good example, right? You could learn about resource allocations, decision making, and negotiation, teamwork, and then selling your friend out at the end. So you could have a lot of different lessons that I think you could take from Catan and use. Kate, you had said before you were playing Pandemic, I think, during the pandemic.
Topically, I have been playing that.
Right. and it's interesting, during times of plagues, gameplay about plagues increases because it's a way of making sense of the world around us and to try to figure out where we fit in. So, Paul, absolutely agree that you can go the other way with that process.
And this brings us to kind of a sort of workplace question around what types of content or games are good for learning at work and which don't really work. And, to kind of give you an example, we build games. I've had experience in kind of creating lots of games with Sponge. And sometimes I'm asking myself the question, is this really kind of working? Has the mechanic that we've chosen going to really make a difference to helping people learn something? And it's to do with how close or abstract it is from reality. So, for example, like a mobile game where you might be doing kind of endless runner and you're trying to avoid little different kind of cyber attack kind of characters. And I'm curious about whether that's a good use of games for learning or other games that we've made, for instance, like simulations of running a business. In fact, actually a vaccine manufacturing business, which we did a project on a few years ago. Which games kind of do work, what content does work, and what doesn't? Carl, I might ask you that first.
So that's a good question. Paul and I had talked about previously how brain games don't necessarily work for transferability. So if you're trying to remember where to put your car keys and you're playing a game where you have to hide the treasure and find the treasure, that's not really going to translate. So the closer I always talk about fidelity. So if a game is close to what you're doing on the job, it can be very, very helpful. So I think strategy games, I think games thinking about competitors. And the thing about a game is, we talked about the magic circle, especially in a corporate environment. If done right, it can take you away from the everyday demands and stress and clutter that gets in the way of thinking strategically and really help you focus on that. So, we do a lot of games to teach declarative knowledge, right? Here, the definition of this, we do matching games. There's lots of ways to teach declarative knowledge. Repetition is what I mean. Games sometimes make that more enjoyable and fun, but most people will learn declarative knowledge fairly rapidly. But what we find a lot that's missing is leadership skills, negotiation skills, communication skills, predicting skills. Corporate leaders don't tend to have those skills. So if you only have a limited budget for creating a game, it's probably better to create one to get to higher order thinking, higher level thinking, than some of the lower order thinking. That's my thoughts.
Paul, did you want to come in on
Yeah.
that?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that there are things that games can do which other learning experiences can't reach, really. So I'd agree with Carl about that. I think the other thing is that the learning has to be entwined with the game quite closely. So I think the classic thing that I have seen people doing, which is not a very good idea, is just giving the sort of gaming element as a sort of incentive. You know, if you do this task, then there'll be a sort of gaming element at the end. I mean, the way the reward system operates, I mean, a lot of these elements like novelty, sharing attention, winning points, all those sorts of action, even all of those things can stimulate the brain's reward system. But actually, that stimulation is very brief. We're talking about seconds. And so the gaming, whatever you're trying to learn has to be very much embedded in the game. And I think some of the less successful efforts that I've seen have been when they remain too distinct, really, and quite separable. It's very clear what the fun bit is, and what the engaging bit is, and what is the learning that you've got to do.
And that kind of makes me think that actually we shouldn't underestimate how complicated it is quite often to create compelling learning games that really work, however simple they may appear to play. That they are quite cognitively demanding on behalf of the designer. Carl, you teach a course, don't you, on game design? What are the tips that you would give designers when they're thinking about translating content into game and learning kind of objectives?
I do. So one of the tips I tell folks right off the bat is to play lots of different types of games. So, you can write a novel because you're literate in sentence structure and that kind of thing. If you really want to create a game, you have to become literate in games. If you've only ever played one game, we talked about Monopoly. Monopoly is a great game, and I don't mean to knock it too much, but if you've only ever played Monopoly, then every corporate learning game you designed looks kind of like Monopoly. And Monopoly is not the greatest framework for teaching, lots of different things. So if you know and play lots of different games, you go, oh, I steal this from here and steal that from here. I think that's a good way to think about it. The other thing that's often missed, and Paul hit on this, is you've got to entwine the learning. So you need a learning goal, but you also need a game goal. So the learning goal might be, for example, to have better conversations with your customer. The game goal might be to negotiate with the Renaissance person to make sure you can buy the right amount of wheat or something like that, right? So those are not the same thing, but one leads to the other. But if you put too much emphasis on one and not enough emphasis on, too much emphasis on the game goal, then it's a game and learning may not occur. Too much emphasis on the learning goal, then it might be boring and people might opt out of it. The other thing is, I think we have to frame the learning correctly in an organization. We're doing this game and here's why we're doing it. Here's our learning goals. Here's what we're going to get out of it. So I think as the game designer, thinking about that is really helpful as well. And then the final thing is that a lot of times people don't think about the aesthetics of the game. And I don't just mean how it looks, although that's important, but how it all hangs together. Sometimes you'll see things like glued onto each other. It looks like, here's a 16-bit character in a graphical, rich, high-fidelity environment. Like, it doesn't make any sense. So we need to think about aligning that and make sure that it's all aesthetically grouped and aligned. Otherwise, people have this, as Paul said about the disconnect, right? We have this disconnect. We still might play it or be interested, but we might be more frustrated and upset by it. And the other thing I want to say is, for like entertainment games, we'll put up with being frustrated because we want to figure it out. And some of the games are like, hey, this is the most difficult level ever, and people flock to that level because they want to try it. In a corporate setting, people are a lot less attracted to really difficult situations. Their time's too valuable. They're too busy. They've got other things going on. It's a game, which is a four-letter word. So I think we really need to be careful how we structure that experience. And what happens often is we're game players. And so we want a game with experience points, and we want the in-game currency, and we want the non-player characters, and we want all that. And then another person says, I don't even know how to, what do you mean WSAD? I don't even know how to turn my character. This game's stupid, right? So simplifying that process works, and using paradigms that people know. For example, lots of people know card game paradigms. So a card game paradigm is a really good tool to create a corporate learning game, because you don't have to explain, oh, you flip over a card, you shuffle the cards, you drag the, people know that, right? So I think that can be really helpful.
I kind of put you on the spot there, didn't I? Because that's like a course that you teach, and I asked you to answer that in like a couple of minutes.
Right,
Thank you for condensing it. Paul, did you want to add anything in there?
Well, it's just really that, of course, you're really also transferring everything you know about learning into this gaming environment as well. I mean, some of the things we've talked about on other podcasts. I mean, how we engage. Well, of course, there's a lot of elements we've already talked about in games that are engaging, but also how you build knowledge, working memory capacity, making sure that the information is relevant. And this is just what Carl was saying, really, that, if it's a very complicated scenario, you're going to be overloading working memory. So just the arrival of that new information that you want somebody to understand is going to be hampered by having lots of buzzes and bells that are not really relevant to what's going on. And then there's the consolidation thing as well. You need to be applying it in an environment that's as close as possible to the real world situation, but also maybe repeating that, and how can you make sure that the game is something that encourages people to repeat it enough times for it to become more automatic. And so that idea of automatization becomes important in games as well.
Well, I was going to ask, that's a good time to just ask this question, which is, are there any studies on transfer that we know that learning games are more impactful or successful at transferring into kind of workplace practice than, say, other methods that we might be using? Do either of you know of any studies on transfer?
There are some transfer studies that show that some concepts and ideas, when you do the debriefing, do transfer to the work environment, and as they're aligned, they transfer. This isn't a scientific study, but interestingly, I talked about the Prussians in the 1600s. They had created this war game, and they apparently did not have that good of an army, but they were beating everybody with this thing called Kriegspiel, which was their wargaming. And so everybody copied that and became as effective warriors as the Prussians. So there's definitely some historic precedent for learning from these kind of games. But there's actually some research precedent as well, where you are able to take the concepts and ideas. ADL Lab a number of years ago did some studies on transferability of simulation-based learning and found some. There was a meta-analysis, I think, by Tracy Sitzman that showed transferability. So there is, but it's hard. I mean, if it's not done correctly, it was a good time or it was a frustrating time, but we didn't learn anything. So the transferability is effective if it's purposeful, designed into the experience, and the designer makes sure it happens. If you don't do that, then maybe it'll transfer, maybe it won't.
I'm really taking away from this conversation that this debriefing thing is important, and I wonder how often we kind of do that, in our kind of game design. And I'm wondering how you can facilitate that in digital learning. Social learning kind of springs to mind, but that seems to be quite an important aspect of this. But yeah, I mean, I don't know, Paul, if you want to.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably worth differentiating between the higher order mental processes that Carl's talking about and the more automatic sort of manual stuff, if you like. So yeah, the debriefing, very important for making learning explicit and applicable and thinking how it's related to your own contexts. But then there's this other type of learning. So with like laparoscopic surgery, where they've found, so this is one of the few areas where they've found that action video games do actually transfer to professional practice. So if you're doing a lot of, if you're playing on your Wii quite a lot and you're doing or action video gaming, actually coordinating movements, very fast response times on a small screen, actually improves laparoscopic surgery skills. And there's a few studies showing that. But that's...
Sorry, Paul, what can you explain for me? What is laparoscopic?
Oh, sorry, keyhole surgery.
Okay,
keyhole surgery. So it's very similar. A surgeon will be looking at a little monitor, and they will be manipulating something which is represented in 2D, but you've got to think about it in 3D, and they're basically they're doing some very small mechanical sort of operation, I guess, although it is a person, but you're still having to very carefully execute movements in particular sequences. And that's the sort of thing that action video games can actually transfer to in terms of skills, and but it's very low. It's low level, so it's not like the higher order thinking that we're talking about in terms of debriefing and transferring to the workplace more generally, and like strategy games, sorts of things.
Well, I'm going to ask just one more question of both of you before we finish, and it's really about the future. And I was thinking about the impact of more sort of emerging technologies, VR, AR, immersive environments, and just whether you see those things having an influence on kind of corporate game uptake, and whether you see growth in this area in kind of corporate games. Perhaps, Carl, I can start with you.
Yeah, so interesting. So in the pandemic, there's definitely a movement toward virtual reality, and people want to do virtual reality games and have virtual reality experiences. And I think the future, I think augmented reality, which is where you hold up a phone or wear glasses and see something in front of you, is going to leapfrog this virtual reality. So the game Pokemon Go is a good example of virtual reality, if anybody's played Pokemon Go, which practically the whole world at one point was playing Pokemon Go. But the idea of projecting something onto a workspace or a piece of equipment or a piece of machinery. So this isn't necessarily a game, and you could certainly gamify that and give points for how quickly you go through or something like that. But just the mere fact that what we do a lot now with training is we teach you everything we think you're going to need to know. Then you go out in the field as a field technician or into the call center, and you try to apply everything that you've learned on the fly immediately to this situation. What augmented reality will allow you to maybe pull up instructions in real time, look at those instructions, troubleshoot, go through a script rather than. So there's a lot of things that it can do. I think that will be very important. I think one thing that we want to not lose sight of is that even with the new technologies, we still have to go back to learning basics and deep understanding. So we talk, you talk about Sully Sullenberger, who landed the plane on the Hudson. He had a lot of practice in flight simulators. He taught people how to fly gliders. He taught gliders himself. That deep, rich knowledge that he had in that once, hopefully in a lifetime situation, saved lives, right? So I don't think he could have done that with augmented reality. Oh, shut down this end. No. I mean, you have to have that deep sense of knowledge. So while there's advantages to this technology, and I think it will carry us very far to the future, we all, I think, always need to consider what the shortcomings are of some of the technology and how we have built deep knowledge over the centuries, and why that's still a critical element in moving learning and development and organizations forward.
Superb. Paul, what are your thoughts on the future of learning in workplaces?
Well, I sort of come from it from a different direction, but end up with the same conclusions, I think, because to my mind, we're still we're talking about virtual reality, augmented reality, but actually we're still struggling to understand how to bring about effective learning in just reality. and we shouldn't. That is a large part of the challenge. But with augmented reality, you're already, in a way, closing down the situation in a helpful way to the personal meaning, the significant context of the learner, and so you're building on what they already know because that's in front of them, and then you're superimposing on top of it. So, I agree with Carl. I think that the augmented reality is likely to take off as possibly being, the most accessibly effective way of learning in the first instance, because it's connecting to what is meaningful, almost inevitably. And virtual reality though is amazing, but it's like, okay, you now have a completely blank sheet. You are a trainer. You can bring anything into this room, experience anything you like. And then you're still facing this immense challenge of what is actually the best learning experience, given that I now have effectively infinite opportunities to be able to, teach and develop this person in these particular ways towards these objectives. So
it's made the life of the learning experience designer a little bit more complicated, hasn't it?
It's not going to make it simpler.
Yeah. And one of the early mistakes, interestingly, one of my first experiences in Second Life, the virtual, kind of environment, it wasn't a VR, but it was virtual spaces. I walked in, it was English as a foreign language. So first of all, it's my first language, so that was weird. But second of all, we walk in and we sat on virtual chairs in a virtual classroom and looked at virtual PowerPoint. And I thought, what a waste.
Yeah.
Classic.
What a waste.
That's why it's so important to understand learning if we're going to be able to really exploit these technologies.
Super.
I'm going to repeat that one, Carl.
It was so sad. They're like put me in a bar, have me order a drink, have me at
go
a
somewhere
bus
exotic,
right? Or just a hotel room. But being in a class, it just made no sense to me.
Well, it does sound like we have got kind of an exciting future ahead. I think one of the things I wonder about is around the budget constraints of these sorts of things and how practical that will be. But different reports have shown that learning games are meant to be kind of on the increase, and I think probably kind of COVID has maybe helped kind of people to think about that more, and organisations to want to gain some of these benefits that games can give us that we've really kind of unpicked today. So I just want to thank both of you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing your knowledge so generously. And any final words anyone would like to say before we go about games?
Well, I always say to folks, play, learn, and have fun.
Excellent. Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I think to understand learning games, you need to understand learning. I think that's
super. We've got plenty of other podcasts that will cover that topic. So thank you very much both. And I will see you again soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.